we're in for a real treat today. I don't know how many of you have heard Dizzy speak in the past, but he has addressed the old crows, especially at some of our holiday parties. But he's working on a very significant effort for the Marine Corps. As you know, the threat space is moving to what we call cognitive or highly adaptive systems. We see that in the communications arena. We're beginning to see that in the radar community. Dizzy's expertise is EW operations. So there's an attempt across all the services to pull together EW with communications and intel and spectrum management so that we can achieve spectrum dominance, especially against a number of countries that are getting very good in that area. So his talk today really will focus on what the Marine Corps is doing in that area. And for those that don't know, Jason is a Naval Academy graduate, although he's in the Marine Corps. And then he went on to fly EA-6Bs as an EWO, and then he also led the ECAP 3 receiver upgrade program. He did the analysis for that. And then his latest assignment is as EW branch head for the Combat Development and Integration Command. And he has under his aegis cyber, electronic warfare, and integration. So without further ado.
Thank you, sir.
Right.
What, nothing? Wow, that hurts. Come on. Come on. Really.
Oh no, that's Army.
Something along those lines.
Fragile ego.
Yeah.
That was a pilot.
Yeah. Fair, all fair. First of all, not only am I a Spectrum abuser, I'm also a chapter president myself. So we have a Charlie Yankee Roost down in North Carolina that we just stood up a while ago. The first president was, if any of you know Todd Caruso Friday, he was the first president. I was the subsequent president and still in that seat, although I'm trying to have an election so that I can move on and get somebody with better ideas than mine into place. The reason I bring that up is I really appreciate the opportunity here to speak in front of, and under the guise of AOC, but more importantly in front of this group here to talk about what the Marine Corps is doing in terms of, so I know electronic warfare is what I grew up with, what I was birthed in, and what I believe in passionately. What you're going to see here today with what the Marine Corps is doing, for those who haven't had the opportunity to listen to me speak in the past, the first thing you have to understand when a Marine gets in front of the group, if you don't know what the term MAGTF means, then I have to start there. So I'm going to start from a basic level to make sure that we're all on the same sheet of music before I begin running my suck, as I like to say sometimes. So who here knows what MAGTF stands for? Give me a show of hands. Just put them up there. So okay, so MAGTF, it's not everybody, good. MAGTF is Marine Air Ground Task Force, MAGTF. And I say that specifically because there is a culture within the Marine Corps, this idea of focusing on the MAGTF, which is sort of part of the very fiber of what we believe in. And I say that because we believe in the idea of I take air things, I take ground things, and I intuitively make them work together in a combined arms sense. Now I know in the military, in the lexicon that we use quite a bit, that is something that we naturally like to think that we always do. But I will argue, in the guise of OSD or DOD, we struggle with that mightily. Okay? The Joint Staff, I think, does a great job, and we have proven it time and time again as a military force that we do it pretty well. However, in the world of electronic warfare, or more importantly, EMS operations or spectrum warfare, it is something that even the Marine Corps has struggled with in the past. I say that very, very purposely, because I was an EA-6B pilot. And I should have known what radio battalion meant and what they did, and I really didn't. I should have known what spectrum management was all about, and I really didn't. So it wasn't until I finally got my butt into a staff job when I allowed myself to open up my eyes and go, holy cow. Holy cow, by the way, is a technical term. But, oh my God, look at all the capability the Marine Corps has. And we have not done due diligence in what MAGTF means for the Marine Corps. We have not done what we should naturally do as Marines, take air capabilities, ground capabilities, or any other capability that we have, coordinate them. I'm going to use the word synergize. So yes, I will use some buzzword bingo today, so if you want to mark it down, I'll give you $1 afterwards, feel free. But we did not do due diligence to make sure that we were doing MAGTFery to what electronic warfare was or is, or spectrum operations as a whole. And I think as well, this audience gets it in the fact that OSD has struggled with that in no uncertain terms. The last 2 decades have been nothing but, I would argue, somewhat tumultuous in terms of IO rises and then sort of falls. Cyber is now the buzzword of today, and what that actually means, I could ask each and every one of you in this audience, hey, what does cyber mean to you? And I would get, if there are 25 people in this room, I would get 25 different answers. Okay, and that is great when we're here in the National Capital Region. Those are all good conversations to have because we all like to think that we're fairly academic. Unfortunately for the operational forces, that means nothing because they want the capability. They want to be protected in the battle space. So hopefully what the Marine Corps is now finally doing is shedding ourselves of worrying about the lexicon these days, and let's start talking about the capabilities. So as I go through my brief, I'll talk about in a broad sense what we're trying to do in terms of some of the lexicon that we're putting in place and some of the thought processes that we have to be able to coordinate all these capabilities, but then more importantly talk about how we are specifically demonstrating those capabilities in an operational environment. So this is an open forum. I know there are a lot of different contexts and paradigms in this room. Feel free to ask a question as I'm going along. I will do my best to answer. The one caveat that I have to put in there, and especially since I'm on camera and I have a microphone attached to me, as I'm going through this, if I'm just speaking, that is the Marine Corps position. However, if you ask me a question and I say, this is what Dizzy says, please take that as this is what my personal opinion is and not necessarily that of the Marine Corps. I will do my best to make an informed decision based on all the different groups that I talk to and so on and so forth. And I feel comfortable in front of this group when I say I understand what Radio Battalion does today, because I've lived their dream for 4 years to the best of my ability. And I think the Marine Corps is doing, and I guess proof positive of that is the fact that the previous Director of Intelligence, now Major General Stewart, and the current Director of Intelligence, Brigadier General Groen, have both endorsed what we're doing for spectrum warfare. They have said that the Marine Corps ISR enterprise must get behind what we're trying to accomplish to support the MAGTF. It is about the MAGTF. And unfortunately, even for me, something like an EA6, being an EA6B pilot, I somewhat hold my head in, I'm not going to say shame, but in frustration in the fact that I didn't have the opportunity to really understand and appreciate the full depth and breadth of what that meant. Because the EA6B has been a national asset that has not really been available to the MAGTF to utilize in its full capacity. So with that, I will begin. Any questions before I start? Okay, a lot of things to cover here on this slide. What I'd like to do with slides is I'll pull out a couple of key points, but if you see something on there that catches your eye, please say so. I do have, though, I do have a laser pointer. Yes, and I'm willing to use it. So that's my line. So the first thing, why do we struggle in electronic warfare or in spectrum warfare trying to gain relevance, whether it's a joint discussion or an OSD discussion or just a bureaucratic discussion? If you're familiar with the JCA construct, or the Joint Capabilities Areas construct, that's the way the joint force looks at requirements and they bin them. Okay, this is a force application thing, this is a battle space awareness thing, this is a command and control thing. Under none of those JCAs does it talk about EW, EMS operations. It's not there. In fact, if you look across all of those tiers that they have from tier 1 on down, and they break it down more succinctly as you go down the tiers, we cover electronic warfare, spectrum operations, arguably covers just about every single one of those JCAs. So it's very hard from a joint perspective to be able to get in front of a group and be able to explain why they should even care about electronic warfare or spectrum warfare. So what we've done in the Marine Corps, especially down at Combat Development Integration Command, that Barry was talking about where I work right now, the integration divisions that exist down there solely exist because the idea that we want to be able to develop requirements for the MAGTF. And we have a 3-star general, now Lieutenant General Gluck, who runs CD&I, and he is the MAGTF advocate. He is the guy. in the Marine Corps. It's a luxury that we have. I know a lot of times you talk to the Army, the Air Force, you say, well, who are you representing? Because that's going to be key to what the conversation is going to be about. For the Marine Corps, aviation, logistics, all of them. If the MAGTF advocate doesn't say that's a priority, guess what? It's not a priority. Now, money aside, I get it, there's politics and so on and so forth, but ultimately that individual has the cog to make sure the MAGTF has what it needs to conduct operations. So when by existing down in CD&I, I have the luxury of being able to reach out to those various integration divisions like Command and Control, like Intel Integration Division, like Fires and Maneuver Integration Division, and be able to tell the story about how electronic warfare or electromagnetic spectrum operations support the various JCAs. So what we've done down in Quantico is we've written a charter specifically to that. Since we don't have an integration division like mine, Cyber EW Integration Division, that doesn't specifically line up with the JCA, we've written a charter that reaches out to all of them, to the entire enterprise, and says, this is what we do in this charter. We define our requirements. We'll prioritize them as appropriate. More importantly, for those charter members, it allows them to go back into their organizations and fight for causes based on the fact that we as a group have prioritized what's important to the MAGTF. And then ultimately the director or the commander of CD&I signs off on that. So it's a luxury we have in the Marine Corps. And I say luxury because the way I see some of the other services struggle, it is a luxury for us. So along those lines, what we've been able to do is, a lot of the latest conversation has been what the VMU is going to be able to do for the Marine Corps in the future. Right now we are struggling to apply monies and actually get that roadmap working in an appropriate manner like we'd like to in a bureaucracy. But at least we are doing due diligence to lay the foundation that says that, hey, the VMU of the future most likely is that go-between that really supports what the MAGTF is all about. What it is to bring air and ground together and be able to take, let's say, sensors that are out in the environment, fuse that information, and then spread that out through the MAGTF, which is what they do today anyway. I mean, a UAS is specifically used for ISR, or video crack, as I like to call it. Okay, that's what they do. They take that information in that very small piece of spectrum, they fuse it as best as they can, and then get it out to the right person at the right time so they can make decisions. So in the context of what the MAGTF needs to be able to perpetuate that idea, if I start putting additional sensors on those platforms and allow them to sort of be the harbingers of that fusion and allow them to be able to direct where and how information gets passed around appropriately, supporting the MAGTF, it really is a nice fit. So along those veins of what the VMUs, so those are fixed wing UAS squadrons, what they've been doing is developing a ground control station system that will be able to facilitate that idea. And they're doing all the analysis that they need to try to figure out what that content data management is, how we're going to be able to broaden, open up pipes, make pipes smaller, make that network more adaptable to the information that needs to be spread between the 2 and the 3 and the 6. The other thing I want to say is 2, 3, 6. Hopefully everybody understands when I say that. 2 being intel, 3 being operations, and 6 being communications or spectrum management. I'll use those quite often, so I want to make sure I don't lose anybody there. The other thing that I'll talk about here off of this is when I say spectrum warfare and how the Marine Corps is leaning forward. Aviation under General Schmidl has been probably the organization within the Marine Corps that has sort of driven the fight right now. He came from being deputy commander of Cybercom, so he gets some of that Gucci stuff that we can do, especially on unmanned platforms that have persistence, can be in different places in the battle space at once. He has really been driving his staff and this idea of spectrum warfare to the point where MAWTS 1, so our Marine Air Weapons Training Squadron, that does all the tactics and procedures for the Marine Corps, has stood up a spectrum warfare division. And they are specifically charged right now with implementing those types of concepts that will allow us to perpetuate the idea of spectrum warfare and how that's going to support the MAGTF going forward. Okay, I'm going to move over here for a second. If you can't see this slide, I apologize, but it's actually a very important slide. And I'm going to go grab my laser pointer real quick because it's that important. This is the concept in a nutshell. So I alluded to earlier how we have all sorts of academic discourse that's going on about what we should be calling what and so on and so forth. So we, when I say we, actually one of the folks in my office, Major Shaner, birthed this picture, this pictorial graphic here, and it's been hacked on quite a bit ever since. But what we want to do is come up with some way of communicating what the complexity of the problem is. So depending on what your backgrounds are in this audience, I would argue that one of these terms in here is a term that you're very familiar with and you're very comfortable with. And you understand the capabilities associated with that. So for example, the information environment. If you're an I/O person, okay, you understand the cognitive dimension, the informational dimension, and the physical dimension. That's your world, that's where you reside, that's what you like. Now you can have conversations all day long with a cyber guy who has a domain, unlike the rest of us. He has a domain, and he likes to talk about the persona layer, the logical layer, and the physical layer. It's the same thing. So in the Marine Corps, what we're saying now is, why are we arguing whether it should be called a persona layer or a cognitive dimension? I don't care. What I will do, though, is I will call it a contested space. It's a space where the enemy has a vote just like we have a vote. So I'm going to shed myself the conversation, what I want to call it. I'll clearly identify where it lines up, and now let's talk about how we're going to operationalize that contested space. Operationalize. That's an important word, because as soon as I say I'm operationalizing something for the Marine Corps, immediately that becomes the purview of the three. And when it becomes the purview of the three, they are the ones that have to ensure that operations taking place in one of those contested spaces are integrated, coordinated, synchronized, whatever word you want to use, with everything else that's going on in the MAGTF. If it's not, that individual is at fault. More importantly, what our commanders get today is, whether you want to call it cyber, whether you want to call it I/O, whether you want to call it electronic warfare, spectrum warfare, I don't care what label you put on it, they do appreciate the fact that these contested spaces are impacting 21st century warfare like we've never seen before. And those commanders that don't appreciate that, this is Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu wrote, "Deception is war." Sun Tzu wrote, "The commander who can achieve victory without firing a shot is truly the best commander." Today, because of the sensors and the capabilities all associated with all these different contested spaces, we have the ability to shape the battle space unlike we ever have before. And commanders get that. So what we're trying to do in the Marine Corps is reduce the complexity of all these various conversations and just say, especially for the Marine Corps, we have expertise in all of this. So let's stop rattling our sabers and let's start sitting down like Marines and rolling up our sleeves and start taking our capabilities and synchronizing it with everything else that's going on in the force. And that's what we're trying to do. So we have, for example, we have our MAGTF EW ConOps that we wrote. If you go online and you type in MAGTF EW ConOps, it will actually pop up. In fact, we got an alert from a certain organization that that might have made its way over into, let's say China. And they were concerned about it, and we told them, no, it's completely unclassed. We're not worried about it. Anyway, so I'm confident that it's been, what's the word I want to use, interpreted in a lot of different languages. So if you don't like English, I'm sure you can find it in something else. Anyway, so we've written a ConOp that discusses this idea of, hey, let's get past what the lexicon is and let's start talking about the capabilities and the fact that we want to be able to support the MAGTF. And again, all these different things and labels that we put on things, what are we really trying to do? We've always focused on the physical advantage. I can get in front of just about anybody and talk about maneuver warfare, friction points, high, lows, economy of force, massing forces, and so on and so forth. But now what we're getting into is this idea of creating a cognitive advantage. Because whether it's an I/O capability or a 2 capability, we now have the ability to reach into the minds of our adversary and really determine what they think. And then relay that information to the person that needs it most. And if that thought process becomes part of the commander's scheme maneuver, think how much more powerful his OODA loop is going to be and how much more quicker that OODA loop will be. And that's what we're trying to do in supporting our commanders. As a side note, interestingly enough, being an EA6B guy, you know, I've always been in this jamming mode. You know, I love jamming things because when I'm jamming stuff, I'm doing stuff, right? What I really learned in the last 4.5 years, and in fact, I was talking to Bridget beforehand, I'm now beginning to read the first electronic warfare history book written by the AOC, and immediately it became clear to me during World War II, it was more important to listen than it was to jam. And I would argue for the Marine Corps, the preponderance of what we're going to bring to the commander is the ability to listen. What I like even more about it is the fact that if I do decide to jam into an environment, I will never jam again. I will never transmit into the environment with the intent of wanting an effect without having somebody with the capability to say, are you having the effect that you want? That feedback loop. We can do that today. There's so many ways in which we can find ourselves reading the enemy's thoughts without getting into too much classification here. Hopefully most of you understand what that means. So how are we going to do that? The cyber, now EMS Warfare Coordination Cell. We chose that. It's really, I tell you what, it's just nothing more than good old propaganda. Everybody understands what an EWCC is, or should. It's well written in doctrine. We understand that an EWCC takes electronic warfare stuff, coordinates it, and then that's how we support the commander. Unfortunately, it's been ad hocery at best in the last 2 decades, whether or not an EWCC ever gets stood up. So we have that basic concept. We stuck cyber at the beginning because we had to pay homage to the cyber gods. I will readily admit that when I get in front of leadership and I say cyber, they tend to, oh, okay, this is something that I care about. If I get in front of leadership and I say this is electronic warfare, and I go, I'm a Prowler guy, I get it. I mean, I just got done telling Colonel Waters a story about how General Mattis, when he was running, I think, the MEF over in Afghanistan, and he made the comment to a radio battalion guy, I don't want those EA-6Bs around because all they do is muck up my communications. Okay, that is really a horrible statement for a general officer to say regarding the MAGTF and a capability that we bring to the fight. But unfortunately, that's the way a lot of them thought. So we have to institutionally get past that paradigm. So while electronic warfare, I love it at its core, we definitely have to do due diligence to make sure that we communicate what coordination can really be when you bring together capabilities associated. So DCO is defensive cyber operations, OCO offensive cyber operations, DoD information network operations. So for the Marine Corps, arguably, R6 does DCO and DoD information network operations quite well. I don't need a cybercom to do that, okay? Traditional ES, EA, EP, I lump into EW. There should be a sidebar here that says that signals intelligence too. Whether it's a Title 10, Title 50 thing, I get it. There are some issues there. But at the end of the day, radios do 2 things. They either transmit or they receive. So I lump our signals intelligence brethren into that. Some might have a heartache with that. Those that understand and appreciate it, get it. And then you have I/O with your information-related capabilities. Ultimately, what a CEWCC is trying to do, again, if I operationalize the contested spaces that I talked about earlier, now the 3 cares. The 3 cares because he realizes that this is going to shape his battlefield like nothing before. So if you're familiar with kill chains and the idea that it's, as I move further to the right, I'm going to put some sort of effect into the environment, the further left I can influence that kill chain, the better. Because I'm probably having to do less or can do a lot more with less. Okay, so now the idea is these capabilities work further and further and further left in the kill chain. So what I'm doing now is I'm trying to reduce the complexity of all this so I can give the 3 something that he goes, oh, I see. Intuitively, he doesn't have to understand it all. He also doesn't understand how to do, or might not necessarily understand how to do mortars. He might not necessarily understand how, ordnance gets delivered from an airplane. But intuitively, they understand what that means as as those supporting fires are helping to shape his battle space. And what do they have? They have an ATO, an air tasking order, to make sure that that's all organized. What we're going to do, or what a CEWCC is going to create, and this is what we're experimenting with at WTI, 2 things. First thing, when I get all the people associated with those capabilities to sit down in the appropriate security environment, i.e. TSSCI, is what we do out in WTI, the first thing they create is a conceptual plan. Now, that conceptual plan may include things that are EMS dependent, and it may not. Ultimately, though, if you go back to that one slide that I showed you earlier, how the EMS really impacts all the way down in the cognitive, even if it's just something like a key leadership engagement, a key leadership engagement should never take place unless I've shaped the battle space beforehand, and I know what's going on and how the battle space is being formed during the meeting, and then what goes on afterwards. There's a whole lot of sensor activity that has to go on to make that happen. A whole lot of receiving and transmitting. So those activities need to be coordinated. So you create a coordination matrix, and that's what we call it. From that, then, you go into your functional planning. So those experts who understand what their capabilities bring and how they'll fit into that coordination matrix, they go off and do what they need to. They come up with their EMS access request, whether it's going to be a listen or a transmit thing, And then the spectrum managers, create an ECO, or an EMS coordination order. And that is just like an ATO. Think of it like this. In a commander's world, an ATO, if an airplane were just to take off randomly, not on the ATO, can you imagine what would happen to that pilot? Probably lose his wings. The way EMS is going these days, people who transmit randomly are mucking up the environment just as much as that guy who's flying around could potentially muck up the environment. And that's kind of the mindset we want to inculcate into our commanders, is the idea, if you don't, once you sign that ECO, it's law. So whether it's a data link, whether it's a UHF comm relay, whether it's a jamming thing, whether it's I want to be able to sense in this environment, I'm only helping the two out here in terms of if you don't put in an EMS access request that says I'm going to be at this time, at this place, trying to listen to this frequency, regardless of what it is that you're listening to or what you're trying to analyze, if you don't coordinate that through the CEWCC, your fault. If you get jammed, that's your problem. Barry.
Yeah, with respect to the ECO, you know, we're moving into a world where things are adaptive and you're not just sitting there listening to one thing. How is that reflected in the ECO?
So what we're going to, that's a good question. And this is what kind of makes the SIX community a little apprehensive as we move forward. So the SIX community right now thinks statically in a lot of ways, although they're getting better at it because the tools that they have available to them are more dynamic. So that idea of here's your frequency, here's the data link that I'm going to, and they think, well, that's it, I've got it. But to your point, what we're going to have to be able to account for in the future is the fact that we can be adaptive like that. So now instead of there being a fixed jerfle, it becomes a dynamic jerfle. At some point, I would argue that the man is going to have to come completely out of that loop and it's just going to have to do its thing. Because we're going to start taking those time. I mean, EW is conducted at the speed of light. So our little brains can't think like that. And at some point, hopefully our systems will become adaptive to that. But that's based on the technology that we bring to the fight. For now, we'll think like Neanderthals. We are all technological immigrants, as I like to say sometimes. We'll all think in our old ways and have this belief that we can still control that in some way, shape, or form.
That's my other reservation with you start these effects further left on the kill chain and you have uncertain outcomes at uncertain times, and yet you're trying to impose central time control. Now the reason the A2 has become so unpopular in the last 10 years because it didn't respond to anything like the events that were really happening. If you're dealing with the mind, perception and beliefs of your opponent, awful lot of uncertainty. You fire a mortar, you know where it's going to land. You start measuring how that came out. A lot of these effects, I just don't know how they're going to express themselves a week, a month, a year down the line, which is what we're talking about.
Very fair. So the key to a CEWCC is the idea. Now, and I just want to emphasize, we're not creating force structure here, by the way. We're just allowing people to do their jobs a little bit better. Okay? So it's not the idea that I have to have more 6 guys, more 2 guys, more 3 guys. It's really the idea of, hey, we just need to all sit down and talk. Okay? So I want to lay that flat. But to get to your point, when you sit down and you put together that coordination matrix, part of what they do is they come up with key points, events that will take place where we think that if the enemy does this, in our conceptual planning, then we can react like this. However, one of the basic tenets of Marine Corps warfare, Royal Marine Corps warfare, I would imagine, is centralized command, decentralized control. I give somebody my intent, and when those moments of opportunity are created, take advantage of that's the purview of a commander. That's the whole idea. And for the love of God, I hope we don't get away from that idea. You know, even though we have more information available to commanders, we still have to allow that person at the tactical edge to look at their situation, understand the intent, and when that opportunity is created, that's the whole idea behind a CEWCC. We want to be able to identify when and how we can create those moments of opportunity where we can dictate tempo, be able to use our technology to stick it to the enemy, you know, create a faster OODA loop for ourselves. Is it going to be perfect? Are there moments when the enemy's certainly going to get a vote? Yep, I get it. There are moments when the neutrals will get a vote. You know, ooh, I didn't think they were using that as an emergency frequency. Guess we can't do that anymore. So what we espouse to, though, is the idea that as long as members are aware of what the enterprise is up to, hopefully we'll be able to react more quickly when those types of events happen. It won't be perfect, but I would argue this is going to make us a lot more effective and efficient in the long run. Go ahead,
Let me
sir.
ask you about the organization of that CEWCC. Multiple players there. Who's the lead of it? And if the 6 is signing off on the ECO, shouldn't that be on your diagram on his side? Who's the leader of that group? And if there's not one leader, how does consensus work in a military environment where you really need a central figure,
Right.
be it the EW officer or whoever that key person is for this coordination and planning?
So that is actually an ongoing conversation in the Marine Corps right now to determine that there needs to be an OIC, and we readily recognize that. Initially, there is an MOS within the Marine Corps called the 8834, which is a Technical IO Officer. I think is the name of it. It's actually a person who goes off to Naval Postgraduate School for a 2-year course in IO, cyber, and electronic warfare. Really unique MOS that the Marine Corps creates. It was initially, we plussed up our Marine Expeditionary Units with additional 8834s for cyber. There's been a lot of churn internal to the Marine Corps saying, that guy's a lot more than just a cyber individual based on their training. He actually fits more into the mold of what a CEWCC is doing, because from the CEWCC, when these coordination documents are created, anybody within the enterprise can then take those to any other coordinating agency within the MAGTF and go, whether it's a fires thing, an ATO thing, and so on and so forth, hey, this is where I need to make sure that my stuff is lined up with your stuff. I can speak for the enterprise when I do this, and then I have that 8834 who can speak to the broader picture as to, if I'm putting mortars down here, how will that impact what the coordination matrix is saying in terms of how is this going to affect the population and shape the battle space. So we do need an OIC. The 8834 was our initial kind of hack that maybe it would be that guy. Through some more internal conversation, what's really kind of emerging, I talked about it earlier, we're taking, or I think I did, we're going to take our ECMOs, our electronic countermeasure officers, that are going away because the EA6B is retiring. I have a slide to this later. And we're actually merging that with our 7315 community. That is the UAS, Unmanned Aerial Systems, our VMU community. So, as we all know these days, flatline is a new growth in DoD. Okay, the Marine Corps is actually not getting rid of EW expertise. We're maintaining our expertise. So we think that maybe that 7315 of the future, because, like I talked about earlier, they have that ground control station that's going to hopefully be sort of the hub, the nexus of a lot of this information activity that's going on, training that individual to understand not only that, but what their payloads do on their UASs, is probably an ideal individual then to train them up to understand how I'm going to take 2, 3, 6 activities and coordinate them. So even though the 6 may create an ECO, they're creating it because they're spectrum managers. Really, because radios do 2 things, they receive and transmit, it really is spectrum management on steroids. But they're creating that ECO for the 3. The 3 signs off on the ECO. It's his purview. He's the one that says it's okay to transmit, it's okay for you to receive. The 6 is just the one that's going to create it because they have all the tools to be able to do that. They are the ones who are most able to take hopefully friendly, neutral, and red emitters and make sure that all of it's deconflicted in our planning. Again, you never know what's going to happen from nanosecond to nanosecond to nanosecond and how we're going to react to that. So that kind of answer your question? So yes, okay.
Big question. When the 3 isn't happy with something, it doesn't follow what their plan is, does he turn to the 6 or does he
Nope.
turn to that?
He turns that OIC and the CEWCC. So the idea is, okay, I get what you're saying. Right. So ultimately what you see here is I see the 2 represented and I see the 6 represented. The CEWCC exists for the 3. That's his tool to ensure that all of this complexity is being coordinated for him. So that the OIC, the CEWCC becomes that push button for him to go to.
So you would think he would sign off on that ECO as opposed to the 6?
No, I just said the 3 signs off on the ECO. The 3 is this, even though the 6 creates it, okay, it's going to be, because that's what they do anyway. That's when you're creating an ECO, I'm basically deconflicting and ensuring that everything is integrated appropriately. Let the 6 take care of that because that's their job. It's spectrum management. All radios receive and transmit. But ultimately, he'll pass it off to the OIC, the CEWCC, who will say, yep, I get it, this complies with the coordination matrix that we made up. Then he'll go to the 3 and say, this is how the complexity of all this, that first chart that I showed you, cyber, intel, signals collection, EW is supporting your scheme maneuver, and then the 3 will sign off on that. And because they have purview over operations in and through spectrum. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So the challenge is, and I've seen this on the joint staff, in the GEMSOC that they want to create, the Joint Electronic Spectrum Operations Center that they want to create. What they want to do is they want to bring a bunch of people in from the 2 and the 3 and the 6 and have them sit physically with the 3, which I would argue in today's world that is a person tax that we can't afford. So really what you're doing is you're relying on the organization and the members to understand their roles and responsibilities, know that they're ultimately working for the 3, but then complying with what they need, the products that they need to produce to ensure that a CEWCC is able to function effectively and efficiently. It's a challenge. But like I said earlier, for the Marine Corps, we're small, we're agile, and we're seeing some success in what we're trying to accomplish here. Go ahead.
I like the organizational part. OSD doesn't like organizations. They like to deal with budget and money. OSD, CIO spectrum, long time EW. My question is, once you stand it up and you get the people, what resources? Have you started requirements for the resources you need?
You're the best segue ever. You're the best segue ever. So,
Is he paid?
what's that?
He gets paid?
Well,
Just show.
I got a piece of gum.
That's okay.
Uh,
More than I got.
Okay, so yes, there is. So arguably, what I will tell anybody who's willing to listen, I will say that spectrum warfare, that concept, the CEWCC, that concept is an organizational challenge, first and foremost, because you got to get members to understand what their roles and responsibilities are. To your question earlier, okay. But as well, there's a technological or a technology component to that. I'm glad you asked that question because now I can talk about that part. So what we've created in the Marine Corps, first and foremost, you have to have an architecture that allows for the facilitation of information sharing, information exchange requirements between the 2 and the 3 and the 6. So what we have in the Marine Corps is what we call our Electronic Warfare Services Architecture, our EWSA, that we have configuration control over, government owned, okay? And that's what I talk about here in this common data sources and formats. We have the standards that we've established for our EWSA so that if somebody brings a node in or something that they want to plug in, here's the interface control document, this is how you plug in. I'll talk about a little bit more of that in detail when I discuss what we're doing out at Weapons Training Instructor course at MOTS 1. Along with that, like anything that we are creating today, is the idea that what we want to be able to do is take the various applications that will use that information to provide something useful for an end user. So within our EWSA, we've created these applications specifically to be able to handle that information. For example, we have within our EWSA a thing called the Reactive Services Bus. So what the end user is able to do is say, hey, I want to listen at this point on the ground because I think they're going to transmit this radio at this frequency. There's functionality in the common display platform that we use here, Raptor X, which is also government owned, to be able to click appropriately, and then the nodes that exist in the environment, there's a voting schema that they do, and then they automatically say, I'm the best one, and it starts listening right there. If somebody else comes online, registers in with the network, and they're better at it, they will automatically do the handoff, unbeknownst to the user. Well, he'll get the notification that it's been handed off. So right now we already have existent within our EWSA the idea of man in the loop and man on the loop and some automated functionality. Again, those are applications that we are running in our electronic warfare services architecture that are specific to the command and control of spectrum operations. Okay, so along with that though, you have all these nodes that you want to be able to plug in. So there's a whole radio aspect to this. What is the radio, or how is the manner that it is I'm going to plug this all into, or plug it all into with? And then as well, what is the means with which I'm going to transport this information? So fortunately for us, we've already done via a Joint Capabilities Technical Demonstration called Corporal. For those of you who are familiar with that old JCTD, a lot of people bought off in the idea that we had an EW payload flying around on a UAS, i.e. this right here. That was not the key to Corporal. The key to Corporal was the establishment of electronic warfare services architecture and the fact that I could take any waveform that I want to and bridge them in to make sure I can pass information between air and ground nodes. I'll talk about that a little bit more when I get into the WTI discussion. What the EWSA also brings for us is the idea, I'm going to actually skip ahead a slide. What the EWSA also does for us is the idea of those other kinds of functionalities like levels of control. So I talked about earlier how we want to be able to get as much control to the tactical edge as possible. However, I don't want a grunt on the tactical edge making assignment changes to vehicles unless they really understand that. So within the EWSA is our levels of control so that if that person there, whether they're with a radio battalion element or they're alone, they can have a PDF that simply says, and we have this functionality that says, you need to stop, do you want jamming on this frequency? Because we detect prohibitive interference. Yes. It goes back in the system, back to the CEWCC, everybody looks at it and says, comply, make it happen. And that node that's supporting them will facilitate that. Also available in our EWSA is just basic functionality like chat, voice over IP communications, and so on and so forth. Again, this is really the key to everything that we're accomplishing right now, especially out at WTI, is this architecture. We've already done due diligence. We have interim authority to test, gone all through our C4 community, and so on and so forth. In fact, the good news is for the Marine Corps, remember I was talking about CD&I earlier, and the fact that the MAGTF advocate establishes the priorities. The EWSA is the #1 priority in the MAGTF. So this concept, this idea of electronic warfare, MAGTF EW, or spectrum warfare, has resonated so well that within that organization, where EW in the past, amongst 270 some gaps that exist, maybe broke into the top 100, we now actually have the top 4 gaps within the MAGTF requirements list. So that's actually a very good news story for us.
I go to one other difficulty. You're drawing together into a complex system a whole range of capabilities. But it's usually best to match the way you fight against your opponents. And we're increasingly fighting opponents who don't go for a centralized system because they know that this fast-acting centralized system does them no good. So they've gone for a disaggregated, slower form,
Right.
which is proving successful in a number of areas.
Right.
And yet we seem to be moving away from fighting on that level. Soft for Iraq, it was very much for disaggregated, and they operated under McChrystal, Brian, just central narrative, all decision making going out, and the speed of killing just increased exponentially. When you draw it all into the centre, you can tend to go for short bursts of intense activity which you can't sustain, and our opponents wait that out and don't respond in a centralised, coordinated, command and control way
Right.
to feel your effects. They're not fighting on the same battlefield.
Right.
So you're doing this, which is very impressive, but they're living and operating here in a slightly different way. Are we mismatched?
So again, I'll go back to the basic tenet of Marine Corps warfighting. So if you go to our Marine Corps doctrinal pub #1, warfighting, it says again and again and again and again, centralized command, decentralized control, i.e., once I have my intent, this is what I want to apply into the battle space, this is what my final outcome wants to be, I empower my commanders to be able to do that. I establish priorities. Who is my priority of effort? Based on those priorities of effort, I give them organic capabilities to be able to execute in that battle space my intent. The whole idea of what a CEWCC does, what a coordination matrix does, what an ECO does, much like an ATO, is now I say to that commander who's at the tactical edge, this is the capability that I'm giving you based on our best intelligence, okay, of what the enemy can do to be able to either proactively do something or have the ability to know what the enemy is up to so I can react to what they may or may not be doing. So the whole idea is that the reason why I'm getting away from singular EA6B, one node in the sky to try to rule them all, to a distributed system where I tie everything together. So, for example, I show you Intrepid Tiger II there flying around on a Harrier today. Okay, we've already got Block 1, which is a sensing capability. That's just an EA capability that covers down in the target set that we've had in Iran and in Afghanistan. I reform factored that and created the pods that you saw on that UAS. So 85% commonality in hardware, 100% commonality in software. Even more importantly, the radio battalion coming out with their new CSAS-2, so Communications and Mirror Sensing and Attack System, their ground EW node, is going to be nothing but another variant of IT2. So now I have, for those various commanders out in the battle space, hopefully the idea that not only, yes, I'm creating central repositories in a sense, because I want to be able to give and pass information around to the right commander at the right time, but I'm also building flexibility into the system so that I can be scalable. Because we always want to be task organized based on the threat that we perceive will be out there.
C2 process is going to run commander over here has an issue, has to make an application in some detail for the change of assets. The decision has to be made amongst a bunch of other assets at probably at 2 levels of command. Then the decision is made, the mechanical ECO has to be changed, and then it's given down. That decision loop.
No. Once you have an asset organic to you,
once
we
you
will.
have it organic, which requires that.
Now the loop becomes closed. And if you're that important, I'll make sure that you either have a radio battalion guy or a 7315 in the future who can directly interact with the nodes that you have right there with the commander to say, I want to listen to this, I want to jam this, I want to, whatever it is that he wants to do. We'll tighten up that loop as tight as we have to make sure that that commander can react appropriately.
The change in an ATO usually takes 24 hours at best.
Any plan never survives first contact with the enemy. So what we need to do is build in enough flexibility into the system. Now, the nice thing about hopefully what we're doing, and we'll just go to it.
If an ATO is pulled apart by ticks in contact, is an ECO unpicked by constant call and change?
So the goal is, there are sensors everywhere. I have sensors on C-130s. I have sensors on E-18, or I'm sorry, EA. Whoa, man, that was a Freudian slip. I have sensors on F-15s. I have sensors on ground vehicles. I have crew devices that need to be tied in. This is a snapshot of what we're doing out at WTI this spring. Okay. Now, I would argue that if a MU, which is about a 2,000 person force or a 2,500 person force, if you include the air combat element, if I can throw out, how many nodes do I count here? I've got 20 nodes right now, I think, maybe a couple more. And that's just a guess. If the operations or if what's going on in that first snapshot that you saw in the operating environment specific to those layers or dimensions or the EMS, if that is the critical component or the critical warfighting contested space that the commander has to be concerned with in order to shape his battle space, the whole idea that we're trying to do is ensure that they have as much organic capability to be able to react to that. So already you're seeing right here where we have 20 sensors tied in to support what they're doing out at WTI. I would argue that this starts producing flexibility for that commander to be able to react appropriately, so that if I've got, say, a Group 3 UAS specifically attached along with a CSAS and a couple of crew devices with a maneuver element, again, my thought process is that even if that element gets cut off, as long as it's in contact with its supported command element, it will be able to react as they need to. If they become overwhelmed, now I want to be able to build into the system where now I can strip assets or keep assets in reserve as appropriate in the ECO. So much like an ATO says, hey, you're just ground turning and you're waiting. The ECO could have the same thing where it's a very dynamic environment. I'm still trying to shape the battlefield with EMS operations, so I'm going to have stuff in reserve so I can make sure that it can react appropriately. That's when I start putting stuff on Hornets and Harriers if I want to be able to move stuff around the battle space quickly, or if I just want persistence in the battle space, putting on UAS or even Group 4-5 UASs, the bigger ones, with more power. So now instead of it becoming, if I have 2 Group 4-5 UASs that can create a lot of power, now instead of it becoming I have to move the asset, I just have to move the assignment. I start reacting at the speed of light to what the ever-changing environment that's taking place within the EMS. That's what we want to get to, is the idea of being able to task organize and give flexibility in the system to allow it to react appropriately. Does that make sense? Hopefully that answers your... I can't say it's not a panacea. I get it, it's not a panacea. Never will be. The idea that I could never have enough power as an EA6B guy, I think as we move forward, it's going to be I can't have enough stuff plugged in and I can't have enough sensors in the... It's about listening. It's about being able to turn... All this has to be plugged into the national system so I can reach back and be able to pull in that data as well and provide that to the...
Working against the opponent who, if he is capable, provides his own deception
How do I got to be able to compare and contrast and the whole 9 yards. Yeah. It becomes it's a cat and mouse game on a scale like we've never seen before. The important thing, though, is I will still argue for the American military, if we do this appropriately, if we start thinking along these lines of we can be proactive in this environment as opposed to the big cyber scare that's going on right now, we can really start being intelligent in the ways that we can, this is a technical term, dork with the enemy. Okay? We start thinking offensively again instead of the defensive mindset that we have right now, which I think is awesome. And in fact, I brought in so we had the VMU COs, the commanding officers from the UAS squadrons, come in, their OPSOs, and I brought in some of the OPSOs from the current Prowler squadrons. We had a big sit-down at TSSCI during their transition, the UAS community had a transition task force meeting. I brought in the pros from Dover to specifically talk about the power of this as the technology begins to get applied in the battle space. All the capabilities associated with cyber, electronic warfare, signals intelligence, and so on and so forth. It is, now you're only limited by how smart you want to be able to fight in that environment. And I need to do that with them so that they could strip their minds of some of the BS that they hear and start thinking differently on how the tactics can be run. I saw a hand up earlier. Okay. I'm getting the go faster sign. What I want to highlight to you is in this context here, the beauty of what we're doing is all the players now that can come to WTI, plug into our architecture, and either A, test their stuff out to see if it works, i.e. Northrop Grumman, or B, be able to show something to the Marine Corps to say, hey, here's an application, here's a new type of waveform, here's a whatever it may be. Do you like it? If you like it, do you want it? It's really kind of the SOCOM model. They do their tried inspectors, the vendors come in, they show them some really Gucci stuff, and they go, yeah, I'll take 20 of those. It's starting to close up that acquisitions loop even to a point where we can start having capabilities that are matching what we're seeing in the battle space in a timely fashion. But again, I'll point this out. We have AFRL, NRL, China Lake, Point Magoo, DARPA, Northrop Grumman, a couple of branches within Northrop Grumman, BAE's coming to play. We have all sorts of vendors now coming to us, plugging into our architecture, and then the warfighter takes those capabilities when they sit down in those rooms, those experts, and they go, hey, how does this work? In fact, I don't even have it up here, but as the architecture grows, now you start including things like F-35 operations. How do we include that into our overall scheme maneuver? And then ultimately, what are we trying to accomplish, as I've alluded to earlier, is the idea is right here. So this is a blow-up of what was in the lower half left-hand corner earlier. What we have here at WTI is your comm squadron, your 3 or your CEWCC on the COC floor, watch floor, and your 2 in your operational command element, or operational control element, OCE. That's the Radio Battalion Command and Control Center. And as well, we have our VMU folks tied in to this. The SIPRNet, that's all these red lines are, is all SIPRNet. It's an isolated SIPRNet, but it's SIPRNet nonetheless. All operating. Included in here we have some ground packable systems in Wolfhound, and as well we made allocations for, we've had in the past, crew devices, Army crew devices, Duke Techno Insert devices plugged into the architecture. So that screen capture that you saw before in the Raptor X environment, all these various nodes have plugins. Those plugins can either be fused with data from applications, or you graphically have that in front of the end user there to say, hey, how is all this interacting? And all of, between the 2 and the 3 and the 6, depending on what their supported and supported roles are, they'll be able to look at those operations and break it down shotgun style. So if I'm a 6 guy, I have what the spectrum management tool that they use is called Speed. And they will continue to use Speed, only now they'll have access to more information, so as things are popping up and they have challenges and conflicts and so on and so forth, they need to dynamically change what's going on in our restricted frequency list. They can spread that through the organization, or if they see issues, they can quickly come up on the net and say, who is doing this? And then if everybody comes up negative, now if it's important, I can start stripping off assets so they can start doing forensics to determine who is it that's mucking up the environment. Could be the enemy, could be just something neutral. Could be a couple of kids out there playing with walkie-talkies, for all we know. We don't want to put a bullet in their head. That would be a bad thing. So again, allowing that decision-making cycle to improve. This idea, even though this talks about the CEWCC on a larger organizational construct, it's important to mention that you can break that down shotgun style. This idea of a 2-3-6 integration can take place at any level of command within a MAGTF. So whether you're an expeditionary unit, a brigade, or a force. And then you just pass information back and forth as appropriate. Go ahead, sir.
Jason, 2 questions. Did I understand you correctly to say that its conflict resolution on the spectrum is manual? I think that was what you alluded to. It's manually deconflicted.
Right now, it's, yes.
So is one of your requirements for the EWSA a sort of a schedule or a resource management for the assets that are using the spectrum that are plugged into your
Right.
network?
We want to be able to build in functionality that will take nodes and be able to apply them in a more autonomous manner based on what's going on in the environment. But for now, because we don't have that kind of, except for some rudimentary applications, right now it's mostly done in a manual manner. Again, through all the the coordination matrix, everybody aligns how they're going to synchronize their operations, and then if we need to change, it's mostly done on the fly manually right now. But again, the more sensors you put out there, the more now that you can start reacting on a EW, on a speed of light sense, as opposed to actually moving physical assets around. I'd much rather move assignments around from node to node.
Lots of
Yes.
efficiency gains in EW and comms and ability to deconflict things on the fly, because as you said, it's a speed of light thing.
Exactly.
You can't go back and say, oh, let's deconflict now, guys, right?
Exactly.
It has to happen.
Exactly.
Izzy, are you willing to stick around there for
Yeah,
5
I
o'clock?
have time.
Well, can you wrap up? If you wrap up, then we have something we want to give you.
Okay, well, really,
We'll open the-
that's kind of the going off the stage slides. I'll just mention real quick. First of all, we are not doing this in isolation. We are working with the Joint Spectrum Command, D2, DI2E, the Defense Intelligence Information Enterprise, who are also creating applications that we want to have access to. So this is not done in isolation. Our engineers are doing due diligence to make sure that our stuff is either compatible with whatever the CIO comes up with, Chief Information Officer, as data standards for DoD or otherwise. The other thing I'll mention again, I kind of talked to it earlier. 7315s are the MOS that are associated with the UAS community. 7588s, what Dean and Muddy used to be there for the ECMOs. We've combined those two communities. The really great thing about this is we literally double the amount of officer cadre that we have within the VMUs. If you repeat that, although I'm not still on camera, we don't necessarily like to advertise that, especially in this day and age, but that's really where they need to go. Again, commanders are going to want this capability. They're going to want to be able to distribute it appropriately to where their priority of effort is. Then as well, though, we've also plussed up permanent staffing for our Marine Expeditionary units to have an EWO. As well, we're going to have liaison officers with our admin permanently in with their operations folks. And you can see down here on the right-hand side where we're putting this expertise in the future to make this concept an enduring one, to constantly educate our leaders so that they fully appreciate what spectrum warfare, MAGTF spectrum warfare, is going to do for them and supporting them in the future. So with that, the one, I can take 15 seconds. This is shameless, I know, but I'm going to do it anyway. I love my job, and I love the Marine Corps, but I'm getting out. I have here a profile sheet. If anyone wants to hire me, please feel free to come pick up one of these. My contact information is on there. I can give you a formal resume based on if you see something on there that you like. So I just throw that out there. Throw that out there for you, and that's part of my conversation as well as I make my transition away. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your time, and you're a very attentive audience. I didn't see anybody nodding off, which the room got a little warm there at the end, so I'm impressed. I am impressed. And yeah, I can stick around for questions afterwards.
Let's thank
You're here.
Well,
I gotta run.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Gary's the man.
all I can say is, wow. The idea of the Crows is to bring a group of people together like this. And you can see why we asked Jason to come to the chapter to talk, and to have people like Troy and Bob and forgot your
Colby.
name again? Colby. And Tom to engage in these kind of discussions. I think it's invaluable, well, very valuable to us. So on behalf of the Capital Club of the Association of Old Crows, we'd like to present you with this
Look this
memento. Okay.
Thanks, Ray. I really appreciate it.
Jason said that he's willing to stick around for informal discussion, so let's adjourn the meeting and feel free to, yes.
Hey, Dizzy, so I think the way you're thinking in the distributed, we've looked at that as being required for a long time. I think the issue we're going to have to face until the cognitive concept becomes more technically applicable to the tactical battlefield is the fact that, and we saw this at Jaido, was when we put 38,000 jammers on the battlefield, those systems were self-protection. And unfortunately, the enemy had commercialized or weaponized commercial systems. So they were all sitting kind of in the frequency ranges that we need to use. So as these massive amounts of energy were being put on these commercial quote frequencies, it caused a lot of problems. It caused problems with communication. It caused problems with command and control. We were crashing UAVs. We were blinding sensors. And I think that becomes a big dilemma. You're on the horns of a dilemma where if I'm doing active planned electronic activity and active planned signals intelligence, I can work to deconflict. But when I start to get into that self-protection mode with the massive amounts of jammers out there on those vehicles, it was extremely difficult to deconflict, and it caused an issue that's going to have to be dealt with as far as comms through jamming. And I think that's where the future emphasis needs to be placed to make something like this work. The construct is great. You know, the idea is great. The way you guys are approaching this, I think, is great. The issue is going to be that piece as far as how do you keep that communication, that on-off, that passing assignments, the listen and jam piece. And the problem was with those self-protection vehicles, we could not control that environment. And the SIGINT guys were looking for the same devices that we had to jam to self-protect those vehicles.
So, as a response to that, I'll give you an example. As soon as we tied in those crew army systems, they stopped being self-protection and they started being sensors. And when you do that, instead of that idea of, because let's face it, a remotely controlled thing, whatever it's doing out in the environment, the enemy wasn't doing that a lot. It was doing it sparingly based on our ability to react to it. So all the other stuff that they were doing, we really had no answer for it. As soon as you get the enterprise working together and you start treating that thing like a sensor instead of just an automaton that just blindly goes out and does stuff, now, if it really is, you really think it's a threat, I can continue to use that as a sensor and then have Overwatch so that if it picks up something, then something happens. It's not just I go do stuff blindly. And when, like I said, as soon as you start tying that in and use it like the sensor that it is, the really good sensor that it can be, because it long baseline interferometry, all the other capabilities that come along with that, it just shifts your paradigm. Now, I will admit, again, there's an education piece there that has to take place. Some troops, I've had conversations down in the integration divisions that I went toe-to-toe with a colonel one day who wanted to spend a lot of money to be able to put in 2 more threats, buy a whole new system so they could go after 2 more threats. And it literally made my skin crawl to think that, why would you do that? Why didn't we build something that will plug in, give it the reprogrammability so that then we can put people like JATO, put organizations like JATO, our Jammer Technique Optimization Group, in charge of coming up with the best technique, whether that's from the air, from the ground. So it really starts twisting the way you view the world. And one of the challenges we're going to have, I will readily admit, is our mindset is single jammer, single threat. Can't think like that anymore. System. And JATO is slowly but surely beginning to react to that, and I think they're going to be able to adapt and provide us the kind of capabilities that we need to be able to implement this in an effective, efficient manner. So that's a great point, though. It's going to be a challenge. Anyway, since I'm just sitting here now.
Okay, I'll ask my question. Being downrange, I understood the MAGTF. The MAGTF was really good from the MAGTF. But I've seen downrange, when you plug the MAGTF into multiple divisions in a larger type of conflict. Luckily in Afghanistan, it was a very permissive EMS environment. We switched theaters and started talking in a not so permissive environment. How do you see your CEWCC fitting in with adjacent forces, whether they be air, wings, naval, or ground?
So,
And I state that, and you know the answer. It says right here, electrons move at the speed of light, and they go a lot further than our artillery. So electronic fire is a huge issue when you're talking adjacent battle spaces with
Right.
commanders that have different priorities.
right. So I'll go back to Gap 1 that we should all be familiar with. And I think at that point, like I said earlier, the Marine Corps is doing everything that we can to ensure that we are abreast of all the developments, considering how it is we're going to fit into the joint force. So whether it's a data standard, whether it's an architecture. I mean, even in the Marine Corps, there's this thing called the Tactical Services Oriented Architecture that Marcorps Syscom is creating to be able to do application services for the Marine Corps writ large, as Sean Cunningham always used to like to say, or still does probably. We're ensuring that our architecture will be able to horizontally integrate with that. There is a challenge. We're going to have to make sure that somebody comes up with a standard, and I think that's what the J. Rockham that just got released talks about, what the CIO is working on, is to come up with a standard so that at a minimum, even though an Army device may come trolling through my battle space, I may not be able to command and control it directly, but as long as I can see it and understand what it's doing, because it may have a higher priority, that's fine. I can deconflict at that point, as long as I can see it and understand what it's doing. And then we'll build in those levels of automation or control that we need to as we go along. But
I'm more concerned with the spectrum-dependent systems within my battle space,
right.
affecting the spectrum-dependent systems within your battle space. I don't have to have my spectrum-dependent system, name the system, go in anywhere. I don't have to be anywhere near your battle space physically for the spectrum-dependent system. But the trons that I'm emitting are definitely going through your battle space and causing.
And that's, again, adjacent units, challenge 101, the whole spectrum sell-off thing. Hey, DOD, get your stuff in one sock and tell me which emitters do you have that operate from this frequency to this frequency. Our 1494s aren't up to date. How in the world can you expect there to be coordination between the services, much less adjacent units, when those adjacent units don't fully understand what's going on? Crap data in, crap data out. So again, that's incumbent upon the system to go, hey, nothing radiates unless it's properly categorized, and then adjacent units should have the tool set to be able to go, this is where all their stuff is, this is where all their stuff is, this is what my stuff's going to be radiated. Never going to be perfect, I get that. It's all based on models and so on and so forth, and you're going to have conflicts. But at least you have a starting point with which to say, I think this is the best plan, and we'll work through it as the operation unfolds.
And that's one of the problems we saw overseas was the fact that we had deconfliction based on frequencies and the frequency managers, but because of the 1494 issue Dizzy talked about, the spurs and harmonics off those systems weren't adequately characterized. So a lot of times the primary frequencies were deconflicted, but because of the spurs and harmonics that were created in the environment, because we were running systems with saturated amplifiers, there was a huge problem that was very, very difficult to address.
That's a great point. It's a great question, and that's why I say this is a six challenge, and it's hopefully they'll step up, and they are. I mean, especially in the Marine Corps. In fact, I was telling Bob earlier, I get a chance to sit in a brief with the deputy of C4 on Friday, specifically regarding what some of the stuff is that we're doing on WTI, and be able to hopefully impress upon him, and they get it. And again, it's just like the two community. Oh, this is what the MAGTF needs. Okay, we better do something.
How does MAGTF or EWSA differ from Iron Symphony?
That's a technical question. Okay, so the EW, I gotta, if anybody knows Lynn Clark, she gave me a discourse on the difference between the EWSA and Iron Symphony. I think Iron Symphony does not afford the kind of a flexibility of being able to run an ad hoc network like the EWSA supports. So in other words, nodes can come in and out of our environment and be able to register and then be able to be coordinated. I think Iron Symphony was more of I have to actually hardwire the code into the box to be able to get it to plug in. I think it's a very rudimentary way of being able to explain the differences between the two. I will say, though, that we were able to take the basics of what Iron Symphony was. We supported the Army during their Advanced Ground EW Systems demonstration, Aegis demonstration. They actually had, I think, they had Iron Symphony running between their crew nodes, but they were having issues then porting that information back into their TOC, their Tactical Operations Center, and then displaying it. So they asked the engineers from Point Magoo if they could have the EWSA and then have the RaptorX environment with the plug-in so they could display it appropriately for the demonstration. Guess how much that integration cost to the government to be able to plug those two in? Almost $91,000. And that was for the T80 cost for the engineers to go over there. So the technology is at a point today where, to get back to your point, it's not hard. This is not a technology problem. This is an organizational problem in getting people to shed their old paradigms and the way they thought. So the demonstration ran flawlessly, and to the point, that's why we were able to plug in those crew devices during the WTI, because we'd already done it. Oh, by the way, I even got surprised. Initially, the Army's network was only Type 2 encrypted. So during the first WTI demonstration that we did, we could only have a one-way feed into our RaptorX environment. We went back to the next one. I was actually taking a young radio battalion first lieutenant. I was just describing to him what's going on and how we were interacting and so on and so forth. And I was in at WTI, the COC is the TAC, the Tactical Air Control Center, or Command Center, sorry. And I was explaining to him, oh, we have crew devices out there. These are actually Army crew devices. Well, we can only see them and so on and so forth. As I'm saying that, I see Captain Kempf sitting down reprogramming one of the crew devices. And I said, hey, what are you doing? He goes, oh, the Army encrypted, we didn't even ask them to do it. They encrypted their network, so now it's a two-way thing, and our plug-in, we can do command and control and reprogram their stuff. It's like, cool. On their own. So, anything else? All right, thank you. I'll stick around for a little bit.